Welcome back to Conservative American Predictions. Today is November 3rd, 2024, and we're going to be discussing the 2024 Senate elections, my final map for them, and what I expect to happen. Previously, I've had the map 5248, but we'll see as it goes, and we'll kind of see where the final map stands. So already I have the safe and very safe states filled out, and there are 3 states that I consider only safe. Those are Maryland, Maine, and Missouri. However, they are still pretty high margins, anywhere between 13 and 15 points, Missouri being the lowest margin and Maine being the highest. So now we'll get into the likely states, and we'll start with the Democratic ones. They are Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, and Virginia, as well as Pennsylvania. So we'll just go west to east with these and start with Nevada. So out of Nevada, Jackie Rosen won by 5 points in 2018, unseating the incumbent Republican. It was a blue wave, though, and this year they're not going to have that working for them. But she is still the incumbent, and the Republican candidate seems to be doing pretty poorly. However, he has been surging a little bit recently in the polls, and I expect him to do all right, but still worse than he should, and I have it going D plus 5.5. Arizona. Kari Lake has been doing much better recently. However, she is still a horrible candidate, and despite her surging in some polls, including Atlas Intel, a very accurate poll, I expect her to still lose by a probably low likely margin by about 5.5 points as well. However, it is still a likely loss. New Mexico, same thing, however, but by a larger margin, as Martin Heinrich won by over 20 points in 2018. However, this was because he was facing off against a no-name challenger, and an independent candidate, Gary Johnson, took many Republican votes. As you can see, the poll average has it at Heinrich plus 10.5, which I think is pretty accurate. I have it about Heinrich plus 9 right now, so overall, a pretty fair margin. And then after this, we go to the 2 other likely Democratic states, Pennsylvania and Virginia. We'll start with Virginia, which I have barely avoiding being a safe state. The incumbent Democrat, Tim Kaine, is pretty popular. He is up by about 10 or 12 points in the polls, and that is a pretty strong margin. It is a little bit less than 12 points now. I apologize, it's not showing. However, it's an 11.9% margin if you go to the second, or actually it's a 10.9 margin. It did drop a bit, which is good news for Hunkow. As you can see, it was because of a Kaine plus, or just a Kaine plus 2 poll, which is a lot lower than it should be. But overall, it is a pretty easy win for Tim Kaine. I have it about probably D plus, probably 10.5 or so. Anywhere from 10 to 11, I'd say, is where I have it. But I'm going to lock it in at, I'll say D plus 10, and just keep it at that. Pennsylvania is a state where Republicans tend to get overestimated in Senate races, and I expect them to again this year. As you can see, the poll average has Casey up by 3 points, which is a lot lower than I expect him to win by, as that's the same thing that happened in 2022. Dr. Mehmet Oz was up by about 0.5% in the final polls. However, Fetterman ended up beating him by 5 points as a non-incumbent, a little under 5 points. And I expect the same thing to happen this year. Bob Casey winning by a little bit more than 5 points, probably by about 5.5 to 6 points. I'm going to lock it in at 5 points, 5.5 points for now, but it is still a likely margin. And then for the Republicans, they have a couple of likely states: the state of Florida, the state of Nebraska, and the state of Montana. So we'll start with Florida first, as I think it's going to be the highest margin. The poll average does have it pretty close, however. The early vote in Florida is just so good for Republicans to the point where I think that they're going to win it by around 9 to 10 points. That is maybe a little bit high. Maybe that's on the higher end. However, I think it's still very possible. I mean, the most recent poll has Scott up by 8, and the poll average has him up by 4.7. But again, this is a pretty easy win for Republicans now that Iowa has become more Republican-leaning. And again, the early vote is just looking so good for Republicans. They're up by 12 points right now. And again, early vote usually favors Democrats, so that is very good news for them. Then out of Montana, the second highest margin, I have R plus 6 right now. And there have been some recent polls showing it being a little bit closer. However, it is still a flip for Republicans, and a likely flip at that. The poll average has Tim Sheehy up by 5.5, and some polls have been showing it pretty close, but a majority of them have shown it over 5 points, and I expect that to be a similar margin to what it is, about a 6-point win for the Republicans. And then Nebraska, this is a shift up from when I had it lean Republican. Yes, I still think that Dan Osborne is a terrific candidate. However, a couple of non-internal polls have showed the race being a little bit closer, sitting at a couple points above the 5 points needed to be a lean race. As you can see here, one done by YouGov showed Fisher up by 7, and then a Deb Fisher internal, which I think is going to be more accurate than an Osborne internal, at least this far into the race. It shows her up by 8. I have the race at about 5.5 points, so that is a win for Republicans, but definitely more narrow than it should be. And then we come down to the final 4 states, the lean and tilt states, and I'll start with the highest state first. That is not Nebraska. That is Michigan, which is about a 4-point win for the Democrat Elisa Slotkin running against Mike Rogers. So if you go to if you go to Michigan, Democrats are expected to do pretty well here. As you can see, they're winning by about 4 points, and that's because Rogers really isn't that terrific of a candidate, and a lot of polls have shown Slotkin doing very well. Now, Atlas Intel has interestingly been showing a lot of expected Democrats doing pretty poorly in their bid for the Senate, and I think it's going to be another kind of example here. I do expect Slotkin to win by a considerable margin, again, about 4 points, very similar to this average. But I could see it maybe being a little bit closer, as Trump is going to make it fairly close on the presidential level. And then after this, the next highest race is actually going to be the state of Texas, which I have being lean Republican. I think that you're going to see Ted Cruz narrowly hold the seat, at least narrowly compared to what it should be. 2018, he won by around 3 points against Beto O'Rourke, and O'Rourke was a pretty strong candidate. He was fairly moderate at the time, and he appealed to basically everyone that he had to in Texas, and he still lost. And this year, Colin Allred isn't as good of a candidate, and I think that he'll still do well. The polls do agree with that. However, at the end of the day, it is still Texas, and with Trump winning up by a considerable margin at the top of the ticket, I expect it to hold for the Republicans by a lean margin of probably about 3.5 points, very similar to the average here shown as 3.3%. And then Wisconsin, the last lean state, I have it going for the incumbent Tammy Baldwin by 2.5%. She is not running a terrific campaign. However, Eric Hovde, the Republican, is. But despite that, with Baldwin being the incumbent, it's going to be hard to unseat her, even though Trump might win the state on the presidential level. So as you can see here, the average has it 2.2%. I have it a little bit more favorable towards Baldwin, but that is still very similar. That's about a 2.5% win for the incumbent Tammy Baldwin. And the final state is Ohio. This is going to determine if Republicans have a narrow Senate majority or if they actually have a somewhat decent majority. And I'd say right now that Democrats are going to narrowly hold Ohio. Now, for a while, I've said this is going to go tilt Republican. However, this late in the game, with Ohio still being a lean margin on the average, I think it's a little too late for Republicans to surge. And yes, Trump is still going to carry the state by a decent margin. But at this point, I think that Brown is going to end up winning. He's going to do well enough in the working class areas of the state. He's going to do very well in the suburban areas of the state that he pulls himself over the top. He's going to outrun Harris by a long shot in basically everywhere in the state. And again, he's going to win by about 0.25%. A very, very narrow win, but a win nonetheless. So this is my final video on my Senate prediction for 2024. Yes, things could change before Election Day, and if they do, I'll make a community post about them. The only race I expect to really potentially change is Ohio. However, I could see it going tilt Republican before election night. I'll make sure to keep you guys updated. But again, final election prediction for the Senate. I hope you did enjoy, and I'll see you guys next time.